I was 25, a few years into my job at a mid-sized corporate firm, quietly tucked away in the operations department. Most days were routine, deadlines, reports, and the occasional nerve-wracking meeting with my boss, Miss Samira. She was a woman of poise and precision, the kind who made you sit up straighter just by walking into the room. Our relationship was strictly professional, cordial at best. She wasn't unkind, but she wasn't warm either. One Friday afternoon, as I was packing up to leave, she stopped by my desk. "Do you have plans this weekend?" she asked, her tone neutral but her gaze assessing. I shook my head, a little curious. "Good," she said, almost to herself. "Come to my place tomorrow. I have some things to discuss, work matters." I agreed, though the idea of visiting her home felt strange. Maybe it was about a new project, I told myself. Or perhaps some confidential discussion she didn't want to have at the office. Either way, it wasn't something you said no to. Her house, the next day, was exactly what I imagined. Spacious, minimalist, but with that expensive kind of comfort you can't quite put into words. She welcomed me in with a polite smile and led me to the living room. And that's when I saw her. Alina. She was younger, maybe around my age or a year or two younger, with a softness that contrasted sharply with Samira's polished exterior. She smiled at me in a way that instantly disarmed me, warm and open, like she was genuinely glad I was there. "This is my sister, Alina," Samira said, almost offhandedly, before disappearing into her study to take a call. Alina offered me tea, and I noticed the way her eyes lingered on mine a moment too long when I thanked her. She asked me about my work, my hobbies, where I was from. Her questions weren't forced, they flowed naturally, as if she wasn't just making small talk but genuinely wanted to know me. Over the next hour, we talked more than I had ever spoken with my boss in the months I'd worked for her. She laughed easily, and it was infectious. When I reached for my teacup, her fingers brushed mine, just a light touch, but enough to send a strange little spark through me. She didn't pull away too quickly either, and I caught the faintest glimmer in her eyes. Samira eventually returned, and we discussed a few minor work matters, but my focus kept drifting back to Alina. She stayed nearby, occasionally joining in the conversation, sometimes just watching quietly, her gaze meeting mine now and then in a way that felt almost like a secret being shared. When I left that evening, Alina walked me to the door. "It was nice meeting you," she said softly, her smile lingering. "It was nice meeting you too," I replied, meaning it more than she probably knew. The following week at work, something shifted. Samira, who had always kept a professional distance, began treating me differently. Not overly friendly, but less rigid, more considerate. She asked for my opinions in meetings, complimented my work in front of others. I wondered if it had something to do with Alina, though I couldn't be sure. I found myself looking forward to the occasional moments when Samira would call me to her office, knowing there was a chance Alina might be there. And sometimes she was, bringing her sister coffee, or just dropping by to say hello. Each time, there was that same subtle current between us. A glance that lingered half a second too long. A smile that seemed meant only for me. I didn't act on it, not then. But somewhere inside me, a quiet warmth had begun to grow.
It started subtly, almost innocently. My visits to Samira's home became more frequent over the next few weeks. On paper, they were always for work, urgent reports, confidential files that couldn't leave the house, strategy discussions that required privacy. But deep down, I knew there was another reason I didn't hesitate to say yes each time. Alina. Every time I stepped into that house, the stiffness I carried from the office seemed to melt. Alina would greet me with a smile that felt like sunlight after a long winter. Sometimes she'd be in casual clothes, loose shirts, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. So different from the perfectly curated image her family showed to the world. One evening, after I'd finished going over some documents with Samira, she excused herself for a long conference call. I found myself in the kitchen watching Alina make tea. "You know," she said, her voice quieter than usual, "people assume that being part of a wealthy family means you never feel lonely. But sometimes it's worse. You're surrounded by people, but none of them really see you." I leaned against the counter listening. There was no self-pity in her tone, just honesty. "I think I understand," I replied softly. "Sometimes, even when you're surrounded by people, you can feel completely invisible." She handed me a cup, her fingers brushing mine deliberately this time. Exactly. From that night on, our conversations began to carry a different weight. She told me about her dreams, how she wanted to study art abroad, how she loved painting late at night when everyone was asleep. She spoke of feeling trapped in expectations, of the constant scrutiny of her choices. In return, I told her about my life, my modest apartment, my aging parents who depended on me, my quiet dreams of traveling someday. She never judged, never looked down on my reality. Instead, she listened with an attentiveness I rarely experienced from anyone. There were nights when I stayed later than necessary. Samira would disappear into her study, and Alina and I would end up sitting in the dimly lit kitchen, talking over mugs of tea that grew cold between us. Sometimes there were long silences, but they were never uncomfortable. One night, after a particularly heavy conversation about her family's expectations, she leaned forward, resting her chin on her palm. "You make me feel safe," she said. Something inside me shifted. No one had ever said that to me before. Not like that, not with such vulnerability in their eyes. From then on, I began to feel like I'd found something rare. Someone who saw me beyond my job title, beyond the surface. I didn't dare name it yet, but the thought lingered at the back of my mind. Could she be my person? Of course, I wasn't naive enough to think Samira hadn't noticed our growing closeness. There were moments, brief, sharp glances during dinner or when she walked into a room, that told me she was aware. But she never said anything, and I couldn't decide whether that was a blessing or a quiet warning. One evening after I'd packed up my things to leave, Alina walked me to the door. We stood there for a moment, neither of us moving. Then she smiled a little shyly and said, "See you soon." I nodded, feeling that familiar warmth bloom in my chest. Soon. And I knew I'd find a reason, any reason, to make soon happen again. It was one of those rare evenings when the air felt softer, the city quieter, as if the world had paused just long enough to make space for something important. I had stayed late at Samira's house again, but this time there was no work, only an unspoken agreement that I'd keep Alina company while her sister was out for a dinner meeting. After dinner, Alina suggested we take a walk. The neighborhood was peaceful, lit by a scattering of street lamps and the occasional warm glow spilling from a window. We walked side by side, our steps falling into a natural rhythm, the kind that comes only when you've grown comfortable with someone. For a while we talked about nothing in particular. Her latest painting, my mother's obsession with gardening, the odd stray cat that had been hanging around their porch. But somewhere between the laughter and the silences, I felt the weight of the words I'd been holding and pressing harder against my chest. We stopped near a small park, the kind with a single bench and a swing set that creaked gently in the breeze. She sat on the bench, and I stood in front of her for a moment, trying to gather the courage I didn't know I had in me. "Alina," I began, my voice quieter than I intended. "Do you know what you mean to me?" She tilted her head, smiling faintly. "You tell me." I took a breath, feeling my heart race. "You've changed my life. Before you, I thought I understood connection, but you've shown me something deeper. You see me in a way no one else ever has. And my voice caught, but I pushed through. I can't imagine a life without you in it. Not as just a friend. Not as just a part of someone else's world. I want to build a life with you. Alina, will you marry me?" For a heartbeat, she just stared at me, her eyes wide, as if the words were still making their way through her mind. Then slowly her expression softened, her lips trembling into a smile. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, with a little laugh that was half joy, half disbelief. "Yes. Of course, yes." She stood and wrapped her arms around me, holding on so tightly it was as if she was afraid I might disappear. I could feel her heartbeat against mine, quick and full of emotion. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were glistening. "I'll talk to my family," she said, almost breathless. "I know they'll need time, but I want this. I want you." We walked back hand in hand, and every step felt lighter, every breath fuller. In my mind, the future began unfolding like a story I had always wanted to live. I pictured a small wedding, not the lavish, overdone kind her family might expect, but something intimate and real. I imagined waking up beside her, sharing coffee in the mornings, planning trips, maybe even starting a family one day. That night, when I finally went home, I lay awake for hours replaying her voice in my head. Yes. Of course, yes. It was the sound of my heart finding its place. At that moment, I couldn't imagine anything standing in our way. Alina didn't waste time. The very next day, she told me she would speak to her family about our decision. I could tell she was nervous, but there was a determination in her eyes that gave me hope. She wanted this as much as I did, at least that's what I believed. For the rest of the day, I was caught between excitement and anxiety. Every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was her with good news. But by evening there was only silence. I told myself maybe the conversation had been longer, maybe her family needed time to absorb the idea. The following afternoon, while I was at my desk, Samira appeared at my side. "Come to my office," she said, her voice carrying that clipped, professional tone that left no room for questions. I followed her in, closing the door behind me. She didn't sit at her desk. Instead, she stood near the window, arms crossed, looking out at the city. For a moment, she didn't speak, and I could feel the weight of something unspoken filling the room. "Alina told me about your proposal," she said finally, her back still turned to me. My heart picked up. "Yes," I replied, careful to keep my tone respectful but firm. She turned then, and though her face was calm, her eyes carried a kind of cold appraisal I hadn't seen before. "I have no objection to you marrying my sister," she began, and for a brief second relief washed over me, until she continued. "But there will have to be certain conditions." The word landed heavily. "Conditions?" I asked, though I already felt a knot forming in my stomach. "Yes," she said, stepping closer. "You will need to cut all ties with your family. Completely. No visits, no calls, no obligations. You will live here in our home as part of our family. That's the only way this marriage will happen." It took me a second to process her words. Cut ties with my family? Why? Her gaze didn't waver. "Because we cannot have divided loyalties. And frankly," she paused, her tone tightening, "there are matters of property and inheritance to consider. If you marry Alina, you will inevitably be linked to our assets, our home, our company. We need to be certain you're not here for other reasons." I blinked, stunned. "You think I'm after your money? Your company?" She didn't flinch. "We've seen it happen before. People marry into wealthy families for security, for gain. We have to protect what we've built." The knot in my stomach hardened into something heavier, colder. "So you're saying my love for Alina means nothing unless I'm willing to prove it by abandoning my parents? They're elderly. They need me." "That's unfortunate," she said, almost as if she were discussing a minor inconvenience. "But in our world, sacrifices are necessary." Her words landed like blows. This wasn't about love for her. This wasn't about Alina's happiness. It was about control, about keeping their world airtight, untainted by anyone they couldn't fully own. "I can't do that," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm building inside me. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. A flicker of disappointment, or perhaps satisfaction that I'd shown my limits. "Then you'll have to accept that the marriage cannot happen." I walked out of her office in a daze. The hallway felt colder, the air heavier. Back at my desk, I stared at my computer screen without seeing anything. My love had just been weighed, measured, and reduced to a transaction, and I had come up short not because I didn't care enough, but because I cared too much for the wrong people in their eyes. That night, I lay awake thinking about Alina. I loved her deeply, but I couldn't unsee what I had just learned. Her family's approval came with strings so tight they could choke the life out of me. And worse, I realized they didn't even trust her to choose for herself. They wanted to keep her caged inside the life they had built for her. For the first time since meeting Alina, I wondered if love alone would be enough to survive in a house like theirs. I didn't want to tell her right away. Part of me wanted to protect that small bubble of happiness we'd shared since the proposal, to keep it untouched for just a little longer. But I couldn't look her in the eye without the truth pressing hard against my chest. The next evening, I asked her to meet me in the small park near her house, the same one where I had proposed. She arrived with that same soft smile, but it faltered almost instantly when she saw my face. "What happened?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. I took a deep breath. "I spoke to your sister." Alina's eyes searched mine, as if bracing for whatever was about to come. "They said they don't mind us getting married," I continued. "But there's a condition." She frowned. "What kind of condition?" I hesitated, and she took a step closer. Just tell me. They want me to cut all ties with my family. Completely. No visits, no calls, nothing. And they want me to move in with you, full-time, so I can be part of your family. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak right away. Why? They think I might be after your property or the company, I said, my voice tight. They want proof that I'm not. And for them, that proof means giving up my parents. Alina's eyes softened with something like guilt. I didn't know they'd say that. I shook my head, struggling to keep my emotions in check. Alina, my parents are old. They've worked their whole lives to give me a future. My father can barely walk without help. My mother's health is fragile. They rely on me, not just for money but for everything. I can't abandon them. She stepped closer, her hands finding mine. I'm not asking you to abandon them. Just, maybe we can figure out something? Maybe they can understand. They won't, I said, almost whispering. And even if they could, I can't. I'd be betraying everything I am if I walked away from them. Her grip tightened. I love you. But if you walk away from this, from me, I don't know how I'll. She stopped herself, swallowing hard. The silence between us stretched. I looked at her and saw the same conflict tearing through her that I felt inside me. She wanted me, but she was tethered to her family in ways I could never untangle. I can't agree to their terms, Alina, I said finally, my voice breaking. I won't cut my parents out of my life. Not for anything. Not even for you. She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. I understand, she said, though her voice trembled. I wish I could change their minds, but you know how it is. I can't go against them. A tear slipped down her cheek, and I reached up to wipe it away, but my hand lingered, memorizing the warmth of her skin. She leaned into my touch for a moment, as if holding on to the last thread between us. We stood there for what felt like forever, saying nothing, just breathing in the same space, knowing it wouldn't last. When we finally pulled apart, it felt like tearing something vital from my chest. Goodbye, I said softly. She didn't answer, just nodded, her lips pressed tightly together, and turned away. I watched her walk back toward the house, her figure shrinking with every step, until she disappeared from view. It felt like the end of a chapter one had never wanted to finish. After that night in the park, I didn't set foot in Samira's house again. The route to her home, once familiar and filled with anticipation, became a path I avoided, even when my work occasionally took me nearby. I told myself it was better this way, that distance would make it easier, but the truth was that every step away from Alina felt heavier than the last. At the office, the air between Samira and me cooled quickly. She wasn't openly unkind, but the subtle warmth she had once shown me was gone. Her feedback became sharper, her tone clipped, and the occasional smile she used to give when I did something well disappeared entirely. Meetings with her felt transactional, stripped of the quiet human connection that had once existed. If it had ever been real at all. Alina didn't vanish completely. At first she sent me messages, short but full of longing. I miss you. I wish things were different. Sometimes she would ask if I was okay, and I'd reply honestly, I'm trying. But over the weeks the messages slowed, then came only late at night, as if she could only reach for me when the rest of her world was asleep. And then even those started to fade. I buried myself in my routines. My mornings were for my parents, making breakfast, sorting my father's medications, helping my mother with the small chores that had become too much for her fragile frame. In the evenings I stayed late at the office, losing myself in spreadsheets and deadlines so I wouldn't have to think about what I'd lost. But the emptiness didn't go away. It sat in my chest like a quiet ache, one that no amount of work or responsibility could numb. I'd catch myself thinking about her, how her laughter had sounded in that dim kitchen, the way her eyes softened when she was really listening to me, the warmth of her hand when it found mine. Those memories didn't fade. They clung stubbornly, almost cruelly, as if to remind me of what I'd chosen to let go. It was a few months later when the rumors began. Whispers at the office, bits of overheard conversation I wasn't meant to catch. Alina's name paired with that careful tone people use when they're talking about something delicate but intriguing. One afternoon in the break room, two colleagues didn't notice me walk in until it was too late. Her family's pushing her, one of them said in a hushed voice. Meeting all these rich guys. Apparently they're desperate to find her a suitable match. I didn't ask questions, I didn't have to. The pieces fit too easily. The same family that had treated my love like a transaction was now searching for someone whose background matched their wealth and status, someone they could proudly display without the threat of losing control. I told myself it wasn't my business anymore, but that didn't stop the image from forming in my mind. Alina sitting across a dinner table from some stranger in an expensive suit, smiling politely while her heart was somewhere else. Some nights, lying awake, I wondered if she thought about me still. If she missed the late-night tea, the park bench, the quiet comfort we had shared. Or if she had started to let go, the way everyone eventually does when they're told often enough what they should want. I tried to push the thoughts away, to remind myself of why I'd made my choice. My parents needed me. They had given up too much for me to abandon them in their final years. And yet, the truth was that I had also needed Alina. And losing her left a hollow space inside me that nothing else seemed able to fill. It happened on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. I was halfway through sorting quarterly reports when a plain brown envelope slid across my desk. There was no name, no return address, just my name written in a hurried scrawl. For a moment, I thought it was some misplaced document from finance. But when I opened it, a single sheet of paper and a USB drive fell into my lap. The note was short, typed in a simple font. You deserve to know the truth. Look at the files. Then decide what to do. I sat frozen for a few seconds before plugging the drive into my laptop. Inside were dozens of documents, bank statements, internal memos, scanned emails. The deeper I went, the faster my pulse raced. Samira's family, wealthy, respected, untouchable, had been in quiet financial trouble for over a year. Investments had gone bad. Loans were coming due. The only reason no one knew was because they'd been covering the gaps with questionable deals and favors. And then there it was, an email thread that knocked the air out of me. It was from my boss to Alina. If she's serious about you, she'll make sacrifices. This will tell us whether she's with you for love or for comfort. Don't pressure her. Just see if she's willing to give up her family for you. I had to read it 3 times before the words made sense. My love story, our proposal, our late-night conversations, every warm moment, hadn't just been about us. It had been a quiet experiment. A test. They hadn't cared about my feelings. They'd been measuring my usefulness against their own needs. And suddenly everything clicked. The condition wasn't just about control. It was strategy. If I'd agreed to leave my family and join theirs, I'd have become a permanent fixture in their household, bound by loyalty, trust, and access. But because I wasn't rich, I was a risk, an emotional liability in a game that was entirely about money. I don't remember how long I sat there staring at the screen, but eventually the rush of heat in my chest cooled into something sharper. Cold. Calculated. If they had treated my love like a transaction, maybe it was time I returned the favor in kind. Over the next week, I went through every document, cross-referencing the company names and accounts. The picture became painfully clear. They were negotiating Alina's future marriage, not just for social standing but for an influx of cash. A bailout disguised as tradition. I didn't tell a soul. Not my parents, not my closest friend. Instead, I packaged everything into a neat, encrypted folder and created a throwaway email. There was a journalist I knew by reputation. A quiet bulldog of a reporter who specialized in exposing corporate hypocrisy. My message was simple. Off the record unless verified. You'll find it worth your time. For 2 weeks I heard nothing. Then one morning I walked into the office to find a strange quiet buzzing in the air. People were huddled in corners, whispering over their phones, eyes darting toward Samira's closed office door. By noon the news had broken, not front-page tabloid drama, but a surgical piece in a respected business journal. The article didn't name Alina directly, but it outlined the family's mounting debts, their backroom deals, and the marriage negotiations with influential investors. The tone was calm, factual, and devastating. By the time I left for the day, I'd overheard 2 executives quietly discussing whether Samira's position was sustainable. It wasn't a collapse, but it was a hit. A public bruise on a family that had built its reputation on being untouchable. I didn't feel triumphant. Not exactly. But for the first time in months the weight in my chest shifted. They had reduced my love to a strategy. Now the world was seeing them for what they really were. And somewhere in that tangled mess of pain and vindication, I felt the smallest flicker of something I hadn't felt since Alina and I said goodbye. Control. It was raining the night she came. Not the wild, crashing kind of rain, but the slow, steady drizzle that soaks everything in silence. I had just finished making tea for my parents when I heard the knock on my door. 3 soft taps, hesitant, as if the person on the other side wasn't sure they should be here. When I opened it, Alina stood there, hair damp, eyes already glistening. I hadn't seen her in months, not in person anyway. For a moment all I could do was stare. She looked both exactly the same and completely different. The same softness in her face, but a heaviness in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I led her to the living room. She didn't sit right away, just stood there, clutching the sleeves of her coat like they were the only things keeping her together. When she finally spoke, it came out in broken fragments. "They know it was you," she said. "The leak. The article. All of it." I didn't deny it. I just nodded. Her lips trembled. "I didn't know, I swear. I didn't know they used us like that. I thought the condition was just tradition. I didn't think they..." Her voice cracked and she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I should have questioned them. I should have fought harder for you." I sat across from her, the tea cooling between us. "I believe you," I said. "But believing you doesn't erase what happened." She looked up at me then, eyes red but fierce. "I still love you. That hasn't changed. But..." She trailed off, searching for the words. "It's not just about love anymore, is it? It's about what's left after everything's been broken." The truth hung heavy between us. She was right. We weren't the same people who'd walked under the streetlights that night, when I'd asked her to marry me and she'd said yes without hesitation. That version of us had been untouched by suspicion, betrayal, or the crushing weight of family politics. Now there were too many ghosts in the room. I thought exposing them would make me feel better, I admitted. And in some ways it did. But it also made me realize even if I hadn't, we'd still be here, standing on opposite sides of something too big to cross. Her tears slid down quietly. She reached for my hand and I let her take it. Her palm was warm against mine, familiar, almost enough to make me forget the distance. "I wish I could go back," she whispered. "I wish we could start over somewhere no one knew us." "Me too," I said. And I meant it. God, I meant it. We stayed like that for a long time. 2 people who loved each other but couldn't save what had already been undone. Finally, she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around me. I held her tightly, breathing in the faint scent of her perfume, knowing it was the last time. When she pulled away, she tried to smile, but it faltered halfway. "Take care of your parents. Take care of yourself." I walked her to the door. She paused on the threshold, looked at me one last time and said, "You did the right thing, even if it cost us." Then she stepped out into the rain. I watched her walk down the street until she disappeared into the mist. The ache in my chest was sharp, but there was something else underneath it, a quiet steadiness. I had lost her, yes, but I had kept my self-respect, my family, and my soul. And sometimes that has to be enough.